The Prison in the Sky, How a Police Dog Saved the Girl. No one saw. High above the city streets, in a tower of glass and light, lived a secret hidden in plain sight. To outsiders, Hale Tower was untouchable, a palace in the sky, home to one of the city's most admired women. But on the top floor, 9-year-old Elena was not living. She was surviving. Locked away by her stepmother, denied school, denied friends, erased from every record, Elena's existence had been buried beneath wealth. Her only companions were a ragged doll and the hope that someone, anyone, would hear her. So she folded her pleas into paper airplanes and sent them into the night. It should have been impossible. Those planes could have vanished into gutters or been swept away by wind. But fate carried them to the one pair of eyes and ears that refused to dismiss them, a German shepherd named Asher. When the world ignored her, Asher didn't. This story will take you from glittering illusions to the cold reality hidden behind them, and to the moment when a child's fragile hope met a dog's unbreakable loyalty. Night in the city had a way of dressing itself in lies. From a distance, everything glowed. Streets lined with neon signs, windows spilling warm light, the hum of traffic weaving through the air like a restless song. But there was one structure that stood above all the noise: the Hale Tower. Its glass walls caught every flicker of city light, magnified them, scattered them back in 100 broken directions until it looked less like a building and more like a monument to heaven itself. At night, when the moon hung pale and uncertain above, the tower shone like a crystal spine piercing the sky. People walking below often tilted their heads back, whispering admiration. One day I'll work there. One day I'll live there. But they never looked long enough to see what lay hidden inside. On the top floor, behind those brilliant panes of glass, was no paradise. It was a prison, a silent, suffocating cell disguised in marble and velvet. And inside, a girl sat by the window. Eleanor. 10 years old, though the stillness in her eyes often made her seem older. Her face pressed lightly to the cool glass as she peered down at the city. From here, everyone looked like ants, tiny, free, busy with their lives. She would watch them until her eyes stung, searching for a face, any face, that might look up and notice her. But no one ever did. To the world, Eleanor did not exist. That had been Veronica Hale's design from the very beginning. Veronica was a woman carved out of stone and steel, wrapped in silk only for appearances. Every gesture of hers was deliberate. The tilt of her chin at charity galas, the perfect crimson of her lips when cameras flashed, the calculated softness in her voice when she spoke to investors. She moved through the city like a queen among pawns, her empire built on reputation as much as money. But reputation, she believed, could not survive a child. Elena was the last remaining link to her late husband's fortune, the inconvenient heiress to a fortune Veronica wanted to keep untouched. The girl was a threat, a shadow Veronica could not allow to walk free. And so she locked her away in luxury, a gilded cage of Persian rugs, velvet curtains, gold-framed mirrors, the kind of prison where outsiders would see only wealth, never pain. But behind the glossy surfaces, Elena's world was bare. Her meals arrived on silver trays, slid through a door without a word. They were always the same: bread, fruit, sometimes a bowl of soup, never warm enough, never flavored with care. The silence of the apartment pressed on her like a second skin. Even the walls seemed to echo emptiness, their beauty sharp-edged and cold. Veronica, when she visited, did not come as a mother figure. She came like a warden. "Eleanor," she would say, her voice clipped, polished as glass. Stay quiet. Do not make trouble. Do not try to be seen. The world does not need you. And Eleanor, clutching her ragged doll, the last thing her father had ever given her, would nod in silence. She had long stopped expecting gentleness. She had long stopped asking questions like, why? Veronica's obsession was not with Elena herself, but with erasing her. Every public document listed the child as living abroad with relatives. At every gala, Veronica smiled and spoke of being alone in the world now, a widow carrying her legacy forward. No one questioned her. No one suspected the truth, because the tower gleamed too brightly. On nights like this, when the city lights shimmered below, Elena sat in the window seat and pretended she was not invisible. She let her fingers trace shapes on the fogged glass. Sometimes a heart, sometimes a bird, sometimes just a smudge where her tears had fallen. Her doll lay in her lap, one button eye missing, its fabric worn thin from too many embraces. "Papa said the stars are watching," she whispered into the dark. "Do you think they see me?" The doll, of course, did not answer, but it was all she had left to talk to. In another room, Veronica poured herself a glass of wine and watched her reflection in the mirror. To her, Eleanor was not a child. She was an obstacle, a problem to be hidden away until it disappeared. And Veronica had become an expert in erasure. She erased the child from photographs, from conversations, from memory itself. She believed she had succeeded. What she didn't know, what she could not imagine, was that glass walls, no matter how high, cannot silence a soul forever. Outside, the tower dazzled under the night sky, admired by strangers who passed without suspicion. To them, it was a monument of success. To Elena, it was a cage of crystal bars. And though she was only 10, though she had no voice strong enough to reach the streets below, a seed of resistance had begun to stir in her heart. She pressed her palm flat to the glass and whispered a promise to herself, as though the city might somehow hear, "I will not disappear." The tower glittered on, oblivious. The world kept moving. And yet, in that single whisper, a fragile hope was born, one that would soon find its way out through the smallest of doors, carried on the wings of paper. Morning inside the Hale Tower did not begin with the warmth of a mother's call or the smell of breakfast drifting from a kitchen. It began with silence. Thick, unbroken silence that stretched across the polished marble floors and high ceilings like an invisible fog. Elena opened her eyes slowly, not because she wanted to, but because sleep had never offered her rest for long. The bed beneath her was enormous, sheets of satin, a duvet stitched with golden thread. But to her, it felt less like comfort and more like emptiness. She lay on one side, curled around her doll, the fabric pressed tight against her chest. The doll had once been soft, but now its fur was thinning, one ear torn, a button eye dangling by a thread. Her father had given it to her years ago, back when he was alive, back when her world was still bright. He had called it Bruno, after his childhood dog, and told her, "Whenever you're lonely, Bruno will listen." Eleanor believed him. So every morning, she whispered first to Bruno. "Good morning," she said softly, brushing her cheek against its worn head. Her voice was so small it barely stirred the air. We made it through another night. There was no reply, only the echo of her words bouncing against the tall walls. Soon, the metallic scrape of a tray sliding across the floor reached her ears. It was the signal that breakfast had arrived. And she sat up, heart thudding, not with excitement, but with that peculiar ache of knowing exactly what to expect. The tray always came the same way, placed on the floor outside her door, which was open just a crack before it clicked shut again. Elena never saw who left it. She shuffled across the cold tiles in her thin socks, opened the door just wide enough to pull the tray inside, and sat cross-legged on the floor. A slice of bread, an apple, a cup of lukewarm milk. Always precise, always minimal. Nourishment, yes, but never kindness. She chewed quietly, staring at the door as though it might open wider, as though someone might come in and ask how she had slept, or touch her hair the way her father used to. But no one ever did. After breakfast, the hours stretched endlessly. There were toys, expensive dolls still sealed in boxes, puzzles with pieces never touched, shelves of books that smelled new and unread. Veronica had made sure the apartment appeared like a paradise to anyone who might peek inside. But Elena did not touch them. They weren't hers. They didn't carry the memory of love. Instead, she returned to her worn-out Bruno. She held it close, pressing her nose into its fabric, breathing in the faint, musty smell of years. "Papa, I remember," she whispered, as though the doll could carry her words upward to wherever her father might be. "I remember how you used to carry me on your shoulders. I remember how you laughed when I spilled juice on your shirt. Do you still remember me too?" Sometimes the silence that followed was unbearable. She would squeeze Bruno so tightly that her fingers ached, as though pressure alone could summon an answer. The day crept by in measured stillness. She would walk the length of the apartment, her small footsteps swallowed by the vastness. She would press her hand against the locked door, feel its unyielding resistance, then turn back to the window, the only place that offered the illusion of freedom. Through the glass, she watched the city live, people rushing to work, taxis honking, vendors selling hot pretzels at the corner, children with backpacks running, laughing, shoving each other. She would press her forehead to the glass until it grew damp with her breath. Sometimes, she imagined herself among them, her feet pounding the pavement, her laughter mixing with theirs. But imagination was cruel. It always ended with her pulling away from the window, reminded that the only sound she truly had was the echo of her own breathing. At midday, another tray appeared. Soup this time, watery, with a slice of cheese beside it. Again, silence. No footsteps, no voice, only the brief rattle of metal against marble, and then absence. The apartment felt heavier after lunch, as if hours thickened into chains. Elena would curl up on the couch with Bruno, whispering stories to him. Sometimes she recited fairy tales her father had once told her, altering the endings. In her versions, the trapped princess always escaped, the locked tower always fell. But when she stopped speaking, when her voice trailed off into quiet sobs she tried to stifle, the real tower remained, tall and merciless around her. Evenings were the worst. Shadows pooled in the corners, swallowing the apartment in darkness. Elena would crawl into bed, her stomach twisting from the tasteless food, her chest hollow from the absence of touch. She would tuck Bruno under her chin, whisper one final time, "I'm still here, Papa. Don't forget me." And then silence again. It wasn't just the absence of sound that hurt. It was the absence of love, the kind of silence that made her wonder if she truly existed at all. In the city below, life continued with noise, laughter, arguments, and song. But in the glass prison above, Elena endured another day of sameness, another day of loneliness too deep for a child to carry. The apartment gleamed with gold, but its beauty was a cruel mask. Every polished surface reflected back a single truth. Behind the glamour, there was only a little girl with a ragged doll, whispering to ghosts. And though she did not yet know it, The weight of that silence was carving into her heart something dangerous, something that would one day push her to act, to send her desperate cries out into the world. For now, though, she lay awake, clutching Bruno, counting the seconds until sleep came again. It started with a scrap of paper. Elena had found it tucked between the pages of one of the untouched books on the high shelf, crisp white, smelling faintly of ink and dust. For a long time she simply stared at it. Paper had always seemed ordinary, but here, in the sterile silence of the apartment, it felt like something alive. Something that could carry her voice beyond these walls. She dragged the paper to the small desk by the window and sat down, Bruno, the doll, resting against her arm. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a pencil. She hadn't written anything in months, maybe longer. There was no one to write to, no one to send letters to. Still, she pressed the tip of the pencil down. Slowly, shakily, the words came. "Please help me. I am trapped." She paused, staring at the uneven letters, some slanted, some faint, as though afraid to be read. Her throat tightened. Was it foolish? Would anyone care? Would anyone even see? She whispered to Bruno, as if asking permission. "If I throw this, maybe someone will notice. Maybe someone will come." The doll's one good eye reflected the faint light from the window, silent as always. But Elena took it as agreement. With clumsy hands, she folded the paper. Her father had once taught her how to make paper planes at the kitchen table. She remembered his laugh when her first attempt nosedived, remembered the warmth of his hands guiding hers. The memory filled her with a sharp ache, but it also steadied her fingers now, fold after fold, crease after crease, until the shape resembled the planes he used to make for her. When it was finished, she held it up to the window, heart pounding as though she was about to leap herself. Outside, the city stretched in endless motion. Cars honked, people shouted, neon signs blinked against the dusk. So many eyes, so many lives, and yet none of them had ever seen her. Elena pressed her forehead against the glass, whispered one last time, "Please." Then she opened the window just a crack, enough to let the wind in, enough to send her hope flying. She leaned out and released the little plane. For a second it soared. The paper wings caught the air, dipping, gliding. Elena's breath caught as she leaned farther, eyes wide, watching it tumble gracefully downward. It looked so small against the vast skyline, a fragile bird made of desperation. But below, no one stopped. The paper drifted to the sidewalk, brushed against a stranger's shoe. He bent down, picked it up, glanced at the words. His face shifted, confusion, maybe even discomfort. Then, with a shrug, he crumpled it into his pocket and kept walking. Elena's small hands clutched the window frame until her knuckles whitened. She wanted to scream, to bang on the glass, to shout, "I'm here, please don't throw it away." But no sound left her lips. Only her tears slid silently down, tracing wet lines against her cheeks. She pulled back from the window, pressing Bruno hard against her chest. "They didn't believe me," she whispered. "They think it's a game." But the attempt had lit something inside her, a stubborn flicker. She would not stop. That night, while the city hummed with nightlife below, Elena gathered every piece of paper she could find. Old envelopes, book margins, scraps from the tray notes Veronica sometimes left. She sat at her desk, her little body hunched under the dim lamp, scribbling message after message with shaking hands. "Please help me. I am locked in the tower. I am cold. I am scared." Each message carried part of her heart, each word a piece of her silence shattered into sound. She folded them carefully, whispering to Bruno as though the doll were a co-conspirator. Papa used to say that if you send something into the world, it might find its way. Maybe someone kind will read them. One by one, she dropped them from the window. Some spun beautifully, catching the light as they fell like tiny white birds. Others collapsed quickly, plummeting to the ground. From above, she watched with desperate hope. A woman picked one up, shook her head, and tossed it aside. A boy laughed, pointing at the childish scrawl, then threw it in the gutter. Most people didn't even glance. Every rejection was a blade in her chest. But still she kept folding, kept throwing, because doing nothing was worse. Hours passed. The floor around her was littered with bent paper planes, the waste of her attempts. The city below never looked up. Finally, exhausted, Eleanor sat by the window with Bruno in her lap, her eyes swollen from crying. She whispered into the night, "If anyone can hear me, please don't let me disappear." And though she could not know it yet, though the city seemed deaf to her pleas, her fragile cries had begun to drift into the world. One day soon, they would land at the feet of someone who would not look away, someone who would not crumple her voice into trash. For now, the planes fluttered into the dark, carrying her desperation on paper wings, fragile signals of hope, slipping quietly through the cracks of a city too busy to notice. The city after midnight was a different creature. By day, it pulsed with the rush of commuters, the clamor of construction, the chatter of sidewalks alive with motion. But at night, the rhythm slowed. The lights still burned, billboards flashing, storefronts glowing, but the voices faded. Shadows stretched longer, alleys grew deeper, and the air grew heavier with secrets. It was during these hours that Officer Daniel Cross walked his beat. Daniel wasn't young anymore, though not yet old. At 38, his shoulders bore the quiet weight of a man who had seen too much of the world's grey. He walked with steady purpose, his uniform neat but worn at the cuffs, his gaze trained forward. The city had taught him caution, never to relax, never to assume safety, but it had also taught him discipline. Routine was what held him together. Tonight, like every night, he traced the same path. Down Maple Avenue, past the shuttered bakery, through the narrow strip of park where the lamps flickered weakly against the dark. His flashlight swung low, its beam a pale companion. At his side was Asher. The German shepherd moved like shadow and muscle bound together, his coat a sheen of black and tan, his gait steady, deliberate. He was 8 years old now, seasoned by years of service, but his body remained taut, his eyes sharp. His ears flicked at every sound, the crackle of leaves, the distant rumble of an engine, the faint scurry of rats in the gutters. If Daniel was the mind of their patrol, Asher was the instinct. The leash between them was more than a strip of leather. It was a thread of understanding, years in the making. A subtle tug of Daniel's hand meant stay close. The tightening pull of Asher's body meant something's wrong. They didn't need words. They hadn't needed them for a long time. Daniel glanced down at his partner. Asher glanced up in return, amber eyes glinting under the streetlight. For a moment, their steps matched perfectly, two figures moving as one across the quiet city. The bond had been forged in moments no one else had witnessed. Long nights searching for missing children, tense raids where silence meant survival, long drives home with nothing but the sound of Asher's breathing in the back seat. Daniel had once joked to a rookie, This dog knows my heartbeat better than I do. He wasn't exaggerating. On nights like this, when the city seemed half asleep, Daniel sometimes wondered how much longer he could keep doing this. Not the walking, not the watching, but the carrying, the weight of what they found, and sometimes the weight of what they didn't. Every unsolved case left a scar. Every tragedy replayed itself in the quiet hours before dawn. And yet, he kept coming back. Because Asher kept coming back. The dog pulled gently at the leash now, nose low to the ground, tail flicking. Daniel slowed his steps, letting him sniff. He trusted those instincts more than his own eyes. "Nothing there, buddy?" he murmured. His voice was low, almost tender, though no one else was near to hear it. Asher flicked an ear, gave a quiet snort, then resumed his steady pace. Daniel smiled faintly. It was these small exchanges, the unspoken dialogue, the comfort of companionship, that kept the loneliness at bay. A cold wind swept through the street, rattling a loose sign above a laundromat. Daniel lifted his collar, shivering, while Asher only shook his head once, ears twitching against the chill. Together, they pressed on. To most, a patrol like this looked uneventful, boring, even. But Daniel knew better. The stillness of the city was deceptive. Behind closed doors, violence simmered. In quiet corners, despair lived. His job was to move through it all, alert to the crack in the silence, the flicker in the dark that betrayed something more. And Asher. Asher always knew first. Daniel remembered one night 2 winters ago when Asher had frozen outside a warehouse, ears locked forward, body stiff. Inside they had found 2 children, trembling but alive, hidden behind crates. That memory still carried him, a reminder of why he kept walking these streets when fatigue whispered for him to stop. Tonight felt ordinary. But with Asher at his side, Daniel never allowed himself to believe ordinary was safe. They reached the intersection where the Hale Tower loomed above the city. Even from the street, its glass exterior gleamed like an untouchable jewel, reflecting the neon lights in fractured patterns. Daniel tilted his head up briefly, the way one does before turning away from something too bright. To him, it was just another landmark on his route. To Asher, though, something in the air shifted. The shepherd paused mid-step, ears pricking, nostrils flaring. His muscles coiled, the leash tightening between them. Daniel glanced down, brows knitting. "What is it?" he asked softly. Asher's gaze was fixed upward, toward the glass tower. He gave a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the leash into Daniel's hand. Daniel exhaled slowly, scanning the street. Nothing unusual, just the tower glittering, cars humming by, a couple arguing at the corner. Still, he trusted Asher enough not to dismiss the tension. He knelt briefly, resting a hand against the dog's thick fur. "All right," he whispered. "If you say so, we'll keep our eyes open." Asher's growl faded, but his stance remained stiff, his gaze lingering on the tower's upper windows. Daniel stood, pulling the leash gently. They resumed their walk, the rhythm restored, but not the calm. Something in Asher's reaction stayed with him, lodged like a pebble in his shoe. He glanced back once more at the tower, its glittering facade indifferent, its glass panes reflecting nothing but the city lights. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. Just another night, he told himself. Just another patrol. But Asher walked differently now, more alert, ears angled toward the silent heights of glass. And in that unspoken shift between them, Daniel felt the first tug of something he could not yet name. The wind along 5th Street shifted suddenly, carrying with it a dry rustle that didn't belong to trees or litter. Asher stopped mid-step, muscles locking tight, ears flicking forward. The leash jerked faintly in Daniel's hand, pulling him to a halt. "What now?" Daniel muttered, scanning the shadows. He trusted Asher enough not to ignore the change. When the dog froze like that, something was coming. For a moment, all was still. Then, from above, something fluttered through the air, a small white scrap, tumbling end over end in the glow of a street lamp. It spiraled, dipped, and finally landed right at Asher's paws. The shepherd lowered his head immediately. He sniffed once, then pawed at it, claws scraping lightly against the concrete. His jaws parted, teeth careful, and he picked it up as though it were glass, not paper. Daniel frowned, kneeling down. "What have you got?" Asher pressed the paper into his hand, tail stiff, eyes fixed on him as if demanding he take it seriously. Daniel smoothed the crumpled edge and brought it closer to the light. It wasn't trash. It was a note, written in the shaky, uneven scrawl of a child. "Please help me. I am trapped." The words were smudged, as though written with trembling hands, maybe dampened by tears. Daniel's chest tightened despite himself. He read it twice, then a third time, his eyes narrowing. What the hell? He straightened, scanning the street, then looked up toward the sky. The wind still whispered around the corners of the tall buildings, but nothing else stirred. The Hale Tower loomed across the intersection, glass shimmering in cold reflection. From this distance, its windows looked like blank eyes, impossible to read. "Could be a prank," he said aloud, though his voice lacked conviction. Teenagers were known to throw things from rooftops, sometimes cruel notes meant to scare. But something about the neat folds of the paper, the desperate simplicity of the words, unsettled him. Asher barked once, sharp and insistent, breaking the night air. His body leaned toward the tower, leash pulling taut, eyes locked upward. Daniel tugged gently, but the dog resisted, paws braced against the pavement. "Easy," Daniel whispered, lowering his voice as though speaking to a partner, not a pet. "It's probably nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. He looked back at the note in his hand. The letters weren't the messy scribbles of a joke. They were shaky, uneven, pressed into the page with too much force, as though the writer had been gripping the pencil with desperation. Asher whined, pacing in a tight circle, his nose lifting to the air as if searching for a scent. His body vibrated with restless energy, tail rigid, ears pinned forward. Daniel sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. "You think this is real, don't you?" The shepherd stopped pacing and sat, eyes fixed on him, head tilted in that patient, insistent way only dogs could manage. The message was clear. "Listen. Don't ignore it." Daniel folded the note carefully, slipping it into his pocket. "All right. We'll hold on to it, just in case." Still, doubt gnawed at him. He had been an officer long enough to know the city was filled with false alarms, hoaxes, kids trying to stir panic. But he had also been an officer long enough to know that ignoring the smallest cry could cost a life. He remembered a winter years ago, a case where a child's missing report had been dismissed for hours, everyone assuming she was with relatives. By the time they found her, it was too late. Daniel had carried that weight ever since, tucked somewhere he rarely allowed himself to touch. His eyes flicked up to the Hale Tower again. The building glistened like a shard of ice against the night, indifferent to his stare. From this angle, he could almost imagine someone looking back from one of those high windows, pressing their face against the glass. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to Asher. "We'll keep an eye on it." Asher barked again, softer this time, like an affirmation. They resumed their walk, but the rhythm was broken. Daniel felt the folded paper in his pocket with every step, its presence heavier than its weight. Asher's ears remained pricked, his body tense, his gaze drifting often toward the tower. Something had shifted in the night, though Daniel couldn't yet name it. One fragile scrap of paper, one desperate plea, one dog who refused to ignore it. The city carried on around them, cars rushing, neon glowing, strangers passing without notice. But between the officer and K9, a new thread of unease had been woven. And though Daniel told himself it was probably nothing, his gut whispered otherwise. Asher had never been wrong before. The paper note still weighed heavy in Daniel's pocket as he and Asher continued down the block. The city was quiet here, traffic thinned, sidewalks nearly deserted. A light drizzle had begun to fall, misting the pavement with a sheen that reflected the glowing tower ahead. Asher's pace was different now, no longer the steady patrol stride Daniel knew so well. His body moved taut with urgency, muscles bunched beneath his coat. He pulled forward on the leash, nose angled upward, ears sharp against the drizzle. "Easy," Daniel muttered, tightening his grip. "We're not chasing ghosts tonight." But the shepherd strained harder, each step an insistent tug toward the skyscraper that loomed above them. The Hale Tower rose like a giant shard of glass cutting the clouds, its windows glowing faintly under the night rain. To Daniel, it was just another high-rise filled with offices and luxury condos. To Asher, it was something else entirely. His low growl rolled through the leash, vibrating in Daniel's palm like a warning bell. Daniel stopped beneath a street lamp, rain tapping faintly against the brim of his cap. He crouched beside the dog, resting a hand on Asher's broad shoulders. The fur was damp, warm under his touch. "What is it?" he asked quietly, searching his partner's face. Asher's gaze never wavered from the tower. His ears twitched forward, body stiff as stone, every sense locked onto that gleaming facade. Daniel followed his line of sight upward, dozens of windows, dark or faintly lit, nothing unusual, just another monument to wealth in a city that had too many. "You're worked up over a note," Daniel sighed, rubbing his forehead. Some kid probably tossed it for a laugh. But even as he said it, the words tasted hollow. He remembered the way the letters had been pressed into the paper, shaky and uneven. Not the careless scrawl of mischief, but the urgent hand of someone desperate to be heard. The drizzle thickened into a steady rain, streaking the glass of the tower. Daniel turned to go, giving the leash a tug. "Come on, Asher. Let's finish the route." But the shepherd resisted. He planted his paws against the slick pavement, muscles locked, head tilted upward with a focus Daniel couldn't ignore. Then, suddenly, he barked, loud, sharp, echoing through the wet night air. The sound ricocheted off the tower's glass walls, bouncing back like a hollow cry. For a heartbeat, Daniel swore it didn't sound like just a bark. It sounded like a call and an answer, as though someone far above had heard. A chill slid down his spine. All right, he muttered, patting the dog's side. "You've made your point." He tried to dismiss the unease, tried to shake it off as nerves amplified by rain and shadows. But a seed had been planted. In his years of service, Asher had never reacted without cause. He had tracked children through forests by a single thread of scent, sensed danger in rooms that looked empty, found evidence others missed. His instincts bordered on uncanny. Daniel had built his career trusting them, so why was he hesitating now? Because if he believed Asher tonight, it meant something darker. That somewhere in that glittering tower, a child was alone, reaching out in the only way she could. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head as though to clear it. We'll log the note. That's all we can do for now. Still, he couldn't resist one last look at the tower. The windows stared back blankly, rain sliding down their surfaces like tears. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a faint shadow behind the glass, too high, too quick to be certain. Then it was gone. Asher barked again, softer this time, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. His tail was rigid, his body angled forward, every line of him saying the same thing. There's something there. Don't ignore it. Daniel swallowed hard, the drizzle dripping from his cap. He gave the leash a gentle tug, and this time Asher relented, though his eyes lingered on the tower until they turned the corner, and it disappeared from sight. The rest of the patrol passed in silence, but the rhythm was broken. Daniel's thoughts kept circling back to the folded note in his pocket, to the echo of Asher's bark bouncing off glass. By the time they returned to the precinct, Daniel had convinced himself it was nothing. A prank, a scrap of coincidence. That was what he told himself as he logged the note into his desk drawer. That was what he told himself as he hung up his coat, as he rubbed Asher's ears before heading home. But deep down, in the quiet place he rarely let himself listen to, he felt the first tug of doubt. And Asher, lying at his side with his head on his paws, never took his eyes off the tower's direction. Morning sunlight spilled across the Hale Tower, striking its glass walls until the whole structure gleamed like a jewel. From the street below, it looked like a promise of power, of luxury, of a life untouched by suffering. People hurried past in pressed suits and polished shoes, their eyes glued to phones, their minds already trapped in schedules and deadlines. None of them looked up. None of them wondered what might be hidden behind the glass. High above, Eleanor stood at her window with Bruno clutched in her arms. The night before, she had folded more notes, whispering to her doll that surely someone would care, surely someone would listen. Her small hands had smoothed the creases with determination, her handwriting shakier but stronger, as if she could force her fear into words. Please help me. I am locked away. Don't let me die here. She had let them drift one by one into the dawn wind, watching each paper plane dip and spiral toward the busy streets. Her heart had raced with fragile hope. Maybe today. Maybe someone would notice today. From above, she watched the first plane land near a man waiting for his coffee outside a cafe. He bent, picked it up, squinted at the words. For a moment, Elena's breath caught. His brow furrowed, lips parting. Then, with a scoff, he crushed it in his fist and tossed it into the trash bin. Her chest tightened. Another note floated to the pavement near two teenagers sharing headphones. One of them picked it up, laughed loudly, and waved it in front of his friend's face. Look at this. Some kid thinks they're funny. He folded it into a ball and threw it at a passing bus, both of them laughing until it rolled into the gutter. Elena whispered into Bruno's ragged ear. They think it's a game. Her voice trembled, breaking at the edges. More planes followed, each one carrying her plea. A woman in heels bent to read one, glanced at it for 2 seconds, then shook her head and muttered, "Cruel joke." She left it lying there, crumpled under the heel of a stranger's shoe. A jogger picked one up, smirked, and tucked it into his pocket like a souvenir before running on. Nobody looked up. The city below pulsed with indifference. Horns blared. People argued on phones. A child cried for ice cream, ignored by his hurried mother. The world spun forward, blind to the fragile signals drifting down from above. Elena pressed her forehead against the glass. Each rejection was like a stone striking her chest. She had imagined people gasping, pointing, calling the police. She had imagined someone running into the tower demanding answers. But no one believed. No one even paused long enough to question. Her tears blurred the city into shapes of light and shadow. She clutched Bruno tighter, rocking gently, her whispers spilling out into the emptiness. "They don't care. They don't see me. Papa, why can't they see me?" In her young heart, a new fear began to grow. That she might never escape. That her words would always be mistaken for pranks, her voice drowned in the noise of a city too busy to care. Outside, another paper plane skittered across the sidewalk, caught beneath the wheels of a bicycle. The rider never glanced down. The paper tore in half, dragged along the wet pavement until it disintegrated into nothing. Eleanor shut her eyes, pressing the doll to her lips. The silence of her room wrapped around her like chains. Even her paper birds could not fly far enough to break them. For the first time since she had started, she wondered if she should stop writing altogether. What was the point of sending messages into a world that refused to read them? The city below was blind. It was deaf. And she was invisible. But even in her despair, she couldn't bring herself to stop entirely. The act of folding the paper, of pressing her words into it, was all she had left. Her notes had become her heartbeat, her proof that she was still alive. She whispered again to Bruno, voice hoarse from crying, "One day, someone will see. Someone has to." Below, the city kept moving, unaware that it was failing a child whose cries drifted past its windows like snowflakes. And above it all, Eleanor stood behind the glass, losing a little more hope with each passing hour. 3 nights had passed since the first note. Daniel had tucked it away in his desk drawer, telling himself it was probably a prank. Still, every time he opened the drawer, the sight of those shaky letters seemed to pulse with meaning, as if the paper itself demanded he read it again. "Please help me. I am trapped." He told himself he was being foolish, that the city had too many real cases to chase after scraps of paper floating in the wind. And yet, every patrol he walked with Asher since then carried a tension that hadn't been there before. That night, rain had swept through earlier, leaving the streets damp and gleaming with reflections of neon signs. The air smelled of wet asphalt and ozone, heavy with the residue of the storm. Daniel's boots clicked steadily against the pavement, but beside him, Asher's gait was restless. His tail was stiff, his ears swiveling at every faint whisper of wind. They reached the block where the Hale Tower loomed, its mirrored walls rising like a dark sentinel above the city. The glass caught fragments of streetlight, fractured them into shards of gold and silver that glittered against the night. Asher slowed. Then, without warning, he froze. Daniel felt the leash jerk taut, nearly slipping from his hand. "What is it now?" he murmured, scanning the street. Asher's nose pointed down toward a patch of damp sidewalk near the base of the tower. Something pale clung to the pavement, soaked but intact. The shepherd stepped closer, sniffed once, then pawed gently at it. His growl rumbled low, a sound that made Daniel's skin prickle. Daniel crouched down, lifting the crumpled paper. The rain had blurred the edges, smearing the pencil slightly, but the words were still visible. "I am cold. Please." Daniel's stomach clenched. It wasn't just the words. It was the rawness of them. The first note could have been brushed off as a prank. But this was a child's voice breaking through. A plea reduced to the simplest truth. Cold, fear, desperation. He turned the paper over in his hands, his throat dry. "Damn it," he whispered. Asher circled him restlessly, paws splashing through shallow puddles. His tail was stiff, head tilted toward the tower. He let out another low growl, deeper this time, his whole body tense as though the building itself offended him. Daniel followed his gaze upward. Rows of windows stared back, blank and unyielding. From one of those windows he realized this message had been dropped. Somewhere above, someone small, someone voiceless, was trying to reach the ground. But the city wasn't listening. A couple walked past, glancing curiously at Daniel crouched in the rain. They didn't stop, didn't ask what he was holding. They kept moving, coats pulled tight against the damp. Asher barked suddenly, the sharp sound echoing against the glass. Daniel flinched at the volume, the way it carried upward into the night. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw movement, a faint shadow against one of the lit windows far above. But the rain streaked across the glass, obscuring everything, and when he blinked, the figure was gone. "Asher." Daniel's voice dropped. "What are you trying to tell me?" The shepherd pulled hard at the leash, dragging Daniel closer to the tower's base. He paced along the edge of the building, nose working furiously, growling under his breath. Every instinct in him screamed that this was not coincidence. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, torn between skepticism and belief. He wanted to dismiss it, wanted to tell himself again that this was a child's prank. But he couldn't. Not when the note in his hand trembled with soaked ink. Not when Asher's instincts were locked so firmly on the building. The memory of past failures returned unbidden. Cases where someone had ignored the first warning signs, only to regret it later. Daniel had vowed never to let that happen again. And yet here he was, standing in the rain, clutching a soggy scrap of paper, trying to decide if he had the courage to believe. Asher barked once more, sharp and insistent, his ears pinned forward, his body angling toward the top floors of the tower. The sound reverberated against the glass, and for an instant, Daniel imagined a child pressing her ear to the window, hearing the dog's call and whispering, "They heard me." He swallowed hard, folding the paper carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket beside the first note. His fingers lingered there, as if the two scraps of paper were more than evidence, as if they were the fragile thread of a life depending on him. "All right," he said quietly, his voice swallowed by the rain. "We'll keep looking." Asher's growl faded into a soft whine, and he pressed closer to Daniel's leg, eyes still locked on the towering glass above them. They walked on, but the rhythm of the patrol was broken again. Every step Daniel took, he felt the weight of the words in his pocket. He couldn't shake the image of small hands scrawling them in desperation, then sending them into a city that laughed, shrugged, and kept walking. And though he hadn't yet admitted it fully to himself, Daniel's unease had grown into something deeper, a gnawing certainty that this was no joke. Somewhere above, in that glittering cage of glass, a child was waiting, and Asher was the only one who could hear her. The night was colder than usual. A sharp wind pressed against the windows of the Hale Tower, making the glass tremble faintly in its frame. Inside the gilded apartment, Elena lay curled on her bed, a thin blanket wrapped around her small body. The silence had grown heavier, darker, as though the walls themselves conspired to smother her. Her cheeks were damp from hours of crying. She buried her face in the pillow, her shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that left her throat raw and her body exhausted. Beside her, Bruno, the ragged doll, was pressed tight against her chest. She whispered to it, as though it were alive, as though its stitched seams could hold all her pain. "They don't believe me," she choked out, her words muffled against the pillow. "No one listens." Her eyes were swollen, lashes sticking together from tears. Every paper plane she had folded felt wasted, every desperate message ignored or mocked. She had watched from her window as people crumpled them, tossed them aside, even laughed at them. Each rejection had cut deeper than the last. She sat up suddenly, clutching Bruno in both arms. The lamp beside her bed flickered weakly, throwing her shadow long across the wall. Her hand shook as she reached for another scrap of paper. Her pencil lay on the desk, worn down from her constant scribbling, its tip smudged and dull. She smoothed the paper against her knees, her breaths coming in uneven gasps. This time, she didn't try to craft neat folds or steady lines. This time, she let the desperation pour out of her hand. "Don't let me die here." The letters were jagged, uneven, cutting into the page as though her pencil were carving the words into stone. She stared at them for a long moment, her tears splattering against the paper, blurring the ink. Her chest heaved with a sob she couldn't contain. Eleanor held the note to her heart, pressing it against Bruno, whispering the words aloud in a voice that trembled with both fear and defiance. "Don't let me die here. Please, please don't let me die here." She stood, her bare feet cold against the polished floor, and stumbled toward the window. The city sprawled below, glittering and alive. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath fogging a small circle. "Can you hear me?" she whispered into the night. "Somebody, anybody." The doll's worn face rested against her chin as she opened the window just enough to let the wind in. It rushed against her skin, sharp and biting, tugging at her hair. She leaned out, her small fingers trembling as she released the paper plane. And it caught the wind, spinning, dipping, vanishing into the river of lights below. For a moment she kept her gaze fixed on it, as though she could will it into the hands of someone kind. But as the seconds stretched on, she felt only the familiar sting of hopelessness. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, pulling Bruno into her lap. Her fingers clutched the doll so tightly, the seams threatened to tear. She rocked back and forth, her whispers spilling into the room like broken prayers. "Papa, you promised I wouldn't be alone. You promised." Her small voice cracked, but she kept speaking, as though her words might slip through the cracks in the glass and travel into the sky. "If you're watching, if you can hear me, please send someone. Please don't let them forget me." The city below roared on, indifferent. Cars honked. Music thumped from a nightclub down the block. The world was alive, and yet for Elena, it might as well have been dead. Her body trembled with exhaustion. She lay down again, curling into a tight ball. Bruno pressed under her chin. Her whispers faded into hiccuped breaths, then into silence. The note had flown, but her hope was breaking. For the first time, a thought she had always pushed away crept in. What if no one ever comes? What if I disappear, and the world never even knows? Her eyes closed, hot tears still streaking her face. She clutched the doll one last time, whispering into the darkness, "Don't let me die here." And though she didn't know it, far below, a German shepherd named Asher stirred at the edge of the tower, his ears pricking at the faintest echo of her plea, an instinct he could not ignore. The precinct was quiet that night. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting their pale glow across rows of desks cluttered with paperwork, half-empty coffee cups, and files no one wanted to reopen. The hour was late, the kind of time when silence made every thought louder. Daniel sat at his desk, shoulders slouched, his eyes fixed on the 2 scraps of paper in front of him. The words glared back at him, stark and uneven. "Please help me. I am trapped. I am cold. Please." He had dried them carefully after the rain, smoothing the creases with his palm, but the stains remained, evidence of trembling hands, of desperation written in graphite and smudged by tears or water. He rubbed his face with both hands, leaning back in his chair. He knew what the logical thing to do was: log the notes officially, turn them over to his captain, and let the system handle the rest. But logic didn't always mean justice. He could already hear the laughter in the briefing room if he brought these forward. Scraps of paper? From where? The wind? They would roll their eyes, mark it down as a prank, and toss it into a pile with false alarms and crank calls. Bureaucracy thrived on dismissing what didn't fit clean categories. Daniel exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. He'd been on the force long enough to know how quickly small things were brushed aside. A child's scrawl, a trembling line of words, they wouldn't stand up against hard evidence in a city drowning in cases. And yet, he couldn't shake it. He looked over at Asher, lying curled on the rug by his desk. The shepherd's chest rose and fell steadily, but his ears twitched even in sleep, alert to every sound. Daniel knew the dog was different these days, more restless, more watchful, his gaze too often drifting toward the tower when they were on patrol. It wasn't just the notes. It was Asher's reaction. His instincts had saved lives before, lives Daniel might never have found without him. Daniel's mind pulled him back to a winter 5 years ago. A blizzard had swept through the outskirts of the city, and a child had gone missing from a broken-down car. The search had dragged for hours until Asher caught the faintest trace, leading them to a snowdrift where the girl was buried under ice and barely breathing. She'd lived because Asher refused to let the trail go cold. And then another memory, one darker, heavier. A case when he had ignored a detail. A neighbor's vague statement. A sound someone thought they heard. Daniel had filed it away, dismissed it as too flimsy. Days later, they'd found the boy's body in an abandoned shed. That mistake had carved itself into him. A wound that never healed. He clenched his fists now, staring at the shaky letters on the paper. What if this was the same? What if a child was crying out, and he let the sound vanish into bureaucracy? But doubt clawed at him too. He could ruin his reputation chasing a ghost. A child trapped in a tower. In this city, luxury high-rises were fortresses of wealth, guarded by security and secrecy. It sounded impossible. He whispered aloud, though the room was empty except for Asher. What if I'm wrong? The words hung in the air, heavy. Asher stirred at the sound, lifting his head, amber eyes catching the light. He studied Daniel with quiet patience, as if waiting for him to come to the right conclusion. Daniel sighed, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the desk. He picked up the first note again, tracing the jagged edges of the letters with his thumb. There was no name, no detail of location, nothing to anchor it. Just pure, raw plea. He thought about his own daughter. No, not daughter, not really. His niece, Emily, whom he had helped raise after his sister passed. What if it had been her sending paper planes into the wind? What if no one had listened? The image made his throat tighten. He stood abruptly, pacing the small space of his office. His boots thudded against the linoleum, steady and sharp. He felt torn between two forces, the pull of caution and the pull of conscience. Caution told him to forget it, to avoid ridicule, to protect what little credibility he had left. Conscience whispered louder, reminding him of the faces he'd failed, of the promises he'd made to himself, that he would never, ever let another child fall through the cracks. He turned back toward Asher, who had risen now, standing silently at his side. The dog's head tilted, his gaze unwavering. "You think I should report it?" Daniel asked quietly. Asher gave a low, soft whine, pressing his muzzle briefly against Daniel's hand. Daniel exhaled, shoulders sagging. The decision wasn't made yet. Not fully. But the scales had begun to tip. He couldn't ignore the weight of two notes. Couldn't ignore Asher's unrelenting instincts. Couldn't ignore the gnawing unease in his own chest. He gathered the papers into a folder, sliding them inside with care. His mind raced with the possible consequences, the ridicule, the pushback from superiors. But beneath it all, a single truth burned brighter than fear. If there was even a chance these were real, he had no right to look away. He sat back down, the folder in front of him, his hands pressed against its cover. His reflection stared back faintly in the glossy surface. Tired eyes, lined face, a man caught between doubt and duty. Daniel whispered, almost to himself, almost to the child whose words had reached him. "I won't ignore you. Not this time." And in the silence that followed, Asher settled at his feet again, as if reassured that the first step had been taken. The first sign came at dinner. Daniel set the metal bowl on the kitchen floor with its usual clatter, the familiar sound that always drew Asher immediately. For years, it had been routine. No matter how exhausted from patrols, the shepherd would bound forward, tail thumping, eager for his meal. But tonight, Asher didn't move. He stood by the door instead, head tilted toward the window that overlooked the city skyline. His ears twitched at sounds Daniel couldn't hear, his body stiff with attention, fixed on something far beyond the walls of their small apartment. "Come on, buddy," Daniel coaxed, nudging the bowl with his boot. "You need to eat." Asher didn't even glance at the food. He gave a quiet whine, shifting his weight, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of city lights outside. Daniel frowned. It wasn't like him to ignore food. Hunger never lost to duty, not unless something deeper gnawed at him. Over the next nights, the restlessness only grew worse. Daniel would wake in the dark hours before dawn, to the sound of claws clicking against the hardwood floor. Asher paced the apartment, circling near the door, then stopping at the window. His chest rumbled with low growls that never erupted into barks, as if he was speaking to something only he could sense. Daniel tried to calm him, kneeling to scratch behind his ears, murmuring, "Easy, Asher. You're safe." But the shepherd's body remained taut, his amber eyes fixed on the unseen distance. By the third sleepless night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table long past midnight, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. Asher stood near the sliding glass door, muscles trembling with restrained energy, every line of him carved with vigilance. Daniel studied him quietly, the exhaustion in his own bones weighed down by something sharper: memory. Asher had always been different, more than a dog, more than a partner, an instinct wrapped in fur and muscle, sharpened by years of service. He thought back to the cases that proved it. He remembered the missing hiker in the forest 3 summers ago. The search had stretched past 12 hours, daylight fading, the team ready to call it off. Then Asher froze at a cluster of rocks, nose working furiously, and moments later, he led them to the unconscious man, wedged in a crevice, his pulse faint, but still there. Another time, in the chaos of a drug raid, smoke and shouting blinding the senses, Asher had dragged Daniel sideways by the sleeve seconds before gunfire erupted from the stairwell they'd been about to climb. That split-second instinct had saved Daniel's life. There was the winter storm rescue, too, the one etched deepest into memory. Asher had stopped dead in a whiteout blizzard, ears rigid, barking into what looked like empty snow. Minutes later, they uncovered 2 children buried under the drift, alive, because Asher had refused to move on. Daniel closed his eyes at the memory, the echo of those barks still vivid in his ears. This restlessness now, it wasn't random. He knew that, even if part of him resisted admitting it. Asher had never ignored his food before. He had never prowled the nights without cause. And his attention kept circling back to the same thing, the tower. Daniel rubbed his forehead, weary. He wanted to cling to logic, to rules. 2 scraps of paper weren't evidence. A dog's unease wasn't testimony. And yet, logic had never pulled dying children from snow or dragged him away from bullets. Asher had. The clock ticked past 2 in the morning. Rain drizzled faintly outside, streaking the glass with silver lines. Asher finally settled, lying down near the door, but refusing to close his eyes. His ears twitched, nose lifting occasionally, as though catching scents carried on the wind no human could smell. Daniel watched him from the table, the cold mug untouched now. His own chest tightened with the growing certainty that Asher was carrying a truth he hadn't yet found words for. "You're telling me not to let this go, aren't you?" Daniel whispered, his voice low, raw in the quiet apartment. Asher lifted his head at the sound, eyes catching Daniel's gaze. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the look was enough. Trust tilted then, subtle but undeniable. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling long and slow. He had spent his career wrestling between instinct and protocol, between gut and policy. Tonight, instinct had a face, the shepherd at his feet, restless, sleepless, unrelenting. He thought again of the words scribbled in shaky hands. "Please help me. I am trapped. I am cold. Please." He felt the weight of them press against his chest, heavier than any file he'd ever carried. "All right," he murmured, pushing the mug aside. "We'll see this through. Together." Asher laid his head down again, the tension in his body easing slightly, as if he understood. The silence stretched between them, no longer empty, but filled with something steadier, a promise. The precinct was already alive with noise when Daniel walked in the next morning. Phones rang from every corner, keyboards clattered, officers swapped stories over paper cups of coffee. The hum of the routine was loud, constant, almost suffocating. Daniel moved through it with the folder tucked under his arm, the 2 notes sealed inside. He hadn't slept much. The weight of Asher's restless nights and those jagged words pressing too hard against his conscience. He stopped outside his captain's office. Through the glass, he could see Captain Moreno leaning back in his chair, glasses perched on the end of his nose, scanning a stack of reports. A man built from years of hardened skepticism, Moreno was respected, but not known for patience with hunches. Daniel knocked once. "Come in," Moreno called, not looking up. Daniel stepped inside, closed the door, and laid the folder on the desk. "I've got something you need to see." Moreno sighed, adjusting his glasses as he opened the folder. His eyes skimmed the papers inside, expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, it was with a faint smirk. "Notes? From the wind?" His tone was half amused, half irritated. "They're not just notes," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Look at the handwriting. It's a child's. The words, 'Please help me. I am trapped. I am cold.' That's not a joke, Captain. That's a cry for help." Moreno leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Cross, you've been on the job long enough to know better than this. Kids toss junk all the time. Pranks, dares, TikTok nonsense. You want me to open an investigation because a dog found a couple scraps of paper?" "Asher didn't just find them," Daniel countered, frustration edging his voice. "He led me straight to the Hale Tower, twice. He's restless, refusing food, pacing nights. You know his record. He doesn't get it wrong." Moreno shook his head. "Cross, you're too close to that dog. You start thinking his instincts are evidence. You're in trouble. You want to risk your career on a hunch." On a few words some kids scribbled as a joke. The dismissal stung. Daniel clenched his fists at his sides, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Captain, I've seen what happens when we ignore the little things. I've buried kids because nobody listened when the signs were small." For a moment, Moreno's expression softened, just slightly. But then he exhaled, tired. "We can't chase every shadow, Daniel. We don't have the manpower. If you want to file it as an anonymous tip, fine. But don't expect me to assign a team to babysit a high-rise because a German shepherd doesn't like the smell of the place." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew when he'd lost the argument. He reached forward, sliding the notes back toward himself. "I'll log it," he said flatly. "Good man," Moreno replied, already turning his attention back to the stack of reports on his desk. Daniel left the office, the frustration burning hot under his ribs. He strode down the hall, the folder clutched tight in his hand, feeling the weight of dismissal heavier than ever. Asher waited by the front desk, sitting tall, leash clipped to a chair. His ears perked when Daniel approached, tail wagging once in faint recognition. Daniel crouched, running a hand through the shepherd's fur, his voice low. "They're not going to help us, boy. Not yet." Asher pressed his head against Daniel's hand, his steady gaze unwavering, as if to say, "Then we'll do it ourselves." Daniel stood, decision hardening inside him. Official channels had failed him before. Bureaucracy had swallowed too many cries for help. He wouldn't let it swallow these. He logged the notes as requested, an anonymous tip filed, nothing more, a formality that would be buried by the end of the week. But he didn't stop there. That evening, after the shift ended, Daniel spread maps of the district across his kitchen table. Asher lay nearby, eyes following him with quiet intensity. "We'll start digging," Daniel murmured, tapping the area around the Hale Tower. "Building records, tenant lists, security rosters. If there's a child up there, hidden, someone had to know. Someone had to sign something. We'll find it." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the notes once more. The smudged handwriting seemed to pulse under the lamplight, as though the words themselves were alive. "Please, don't let me die here." Daniel exhaled, resolved to solidify. "If the system won't listen," he whispered, "then we'll make them." Asher gave a soft bark, low and steady, the sound more vow than noise. Together, man and dog sat in the glow of the lamplight, the weight of their task pressing in. The city outside moved on, blind and busy. But within that small apartment, a decision had been made. The notes would not be ignored. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers that dripped light like molten gold, their glow reflecting off polished marble floors and the polished smiles of the city's elite. Waiters drifted between clusters of men in tuxedos and women in sequined gowns, carrying trays of champagne that sparkled with bubbles as delicate as crystal beads. At the center of it all, Veronica Hale stood like a queen receiving her court. Her gown was midnight blue, silk that shimmered with each movement, a diamond necklace resting at her throat like frost. She spoke with measured grace, her laughter soft and practiced, her handshakes firm but elegant. The cameras loved her, the way her hair caught the light, the way her lips curved into the perfect smile when journalists leaned in for quotes. "She's an inspiration," someone whispered near the bar. "Widowed so young, and yet look how she carries herself, always giving back." "She funds children's hospitals, doesn't she?" another replied. "A saint." Imagine having her strength. Veronica heard them, of course. She always did. Praise was oxygen, and she had mastered the art of breathing it in without breaking stride. Tonight's gala was for a foundation supporting underprivileged youth, a delicious irony, though only she savored it. She moved from table to table, each gesture precise, every word polished to perfection. To the mayor, she spoke of community outreach. To a tech mogul, she praised innovation. To the press, she sighed delicately, lowering her eyes just enough to look sincere. "Yes, life has been difficult since my husband's passing," she said, her voice a velvet thread. "But I've found strength in giving back. It's what he would have wanted." Cameras flashed. Pens scratched notes. The image of the grieving widow-turned-philanthropist was sealed once again. No one asked about Elena. They never did, because Veronica had buried her existence beneath layers of lies. "She's studying abroad," she had told acquaintances, brushing off curiosity with a graceful smile. "The transition has been good for her. She's thriving." It was the same phrase every time, rehearsed until even Veronica almost believed it. Abroad, thriving, out of sight, out of mind. The perfect cover for a child locked away behind glass. Behind the scenes, Veronica was different. When the lights faded, when the gowns were hung and the champagne glasses emptied, she returned to the tower where Elena waited in silence. The mask of benevolence slipped, replaced by the cold sneer of control. "You will stay quiet," she would say, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Do not waste paper. Do not open windows. You do not exist." The cruelty was not in shouting, but in the precision of her words. She knew how to hollow out a soul slowly, methodically, and while the city adored her, Eleanor's name was erased. No birthday parties, no school records, no photographs. Veronica scrubbed her stepdaughter's existence from the world with the same polish she used on her public image. At the gala, applause broke out as Veronica announced a new scholarship in her husband's memory. She placed a hand over her heart, lowering her lashes just so, the picture of sincerity. The crowd rose to their feet. The band struck up a soft melody. In the tower, high above the city, Eleanor sat on her bed, whispering to a ragged doll. The sounds of applause and music would never reach her, but the silence of her prison was deafening. Veronica lifted her champagne glass in a toast, her diamonds glittering under the chandeliers. "To hope," she declared, smiling at the cameras. But behind the smile, her eyes gleamed with something colder, a satisfaction that no one had seen through her. Not yet. The world believed in her mask. The city adored its angel. And the girl in the tower remained invisible. Her cries for help brushed aside like shadows at the edge of a glittering stage. The nights were always hardest when Veronica prepared to leave. Elena sat in her usual spot by the window, knees tucked to her chest. Bruno clutched tightly against her. From this high floor, she could see the grand entrance of the Hale Tower far below, where the building's glass doors spilled golden light onto the sidewalk. Chauffeurs stood at attention beside sleek black cars, their polished doors waiting to open. Then came Veronica. Even from a distance, she was impossible to miss. Her gowns shimmered like liquid jewels under the lights, each movement calculated, each smile perfectly placed for the onlookers. Reporters gathered at the curb, their voices rising in praise. "Mrs. Hale, over here!" "A word for the paper?" "Veronica, you look stunning tonight. Who designed the dress?" Flashes lit the air like sudden bursts of lightning, capturing her every tilt of the head, every graceful lift of her hand as she waved. The world adored her. And high above, Eleanor watched, her breath fogging the glass, her small heart breaking with every click of the cameras. She pressed her forehead to the window, whispering to Bruno. "They cheer for her. They think she's kind. But they don't know." Her voice caught, the words trailing into silence. She tightened her hold on the doll until its seams strained. How could they not see? How could the world worship the woman who had locked her away, who spoke to her with ice in her voice, who erased her name from every conversation? The limousine door opened, and Veronica stepped inside, her diamonds scattering light like tiny stars. The crowd outside clapped as the car pulled away, carrying her toward another night of applause, another stage where she would wear her mask of benevolence. Elena's tears blurred the city lights into streaks of color. She imagined herself standing down there among the crowd, screaming until her throat tore. "She's lying. She's not who you think she is." But no sound would ever reach them from this prison. The world only saw the gowns, the diamonds, the graceful speeches. They did not see the locked door at the top of the tower, the silver trays of cold food, the lonely child whispering her fears into a ragged doll. A hot wave of jealousy burned through Elena's chest, surprising her. It wasn't just the applause she longed for, it was the love. The way strangers' faces lit up at the sight of Veronica, the way they leaned forward to catch her words as though they mattered. Elena wanted someone, anyone, to look at her like that, even for a moment. "Why do they love her?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why can't they see me instead?" Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Pale, small, hair tangled from neglect, eyes swollen from crying. She looked nothing like Veronica's polished perfection. She looked invisible. The limousine disappeared into the stream of city traffic, leaving only silence in its wake. Eleanor leaned back against the window, her tears soaking into Bruno's fabric. "They'll never know," she murmured. "She's erased me, and nobody even cares enough to ask." The loneliness pressed harder, suffocating. She had thought her paper planes might pierce the veil, might reach someone who could see through the mask. But each day she watched the notes ignored, laughed at, crushed beneath hurried feet. And each night, she watched Veronica leave in gowns worth more than Elena's entire existence, bathed in praise, while her prisoner daughter whispered into the dark. The unfairness of it throbbed inside her like a wound. But beneath the jealousy and heartbreak, something else stirred, a fragile ember of defiance. She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, staring at the empty street below where Veronica's limousine had vanished. "They'll know one day," she whispered fiercely, clutching Bruno against her chest. "They'll see who she really is. They'll see me." Her words vanished into the silence, but they carried a weight, a vow. And as the tower loomed around her, gleaming cold and untouchable, Eleanor pressed her palm to the glass as though she could push her voice through it. "Don't let me disappear," she whispered to the night. The city didn't hear. Not yet. But her words lingered in the air, fragile threads of truth waiting for someone to grasp. Eleanor sat at her desk, the faint glow of the lamp pooling around her like a small island of light in the vast darkness of the apartment. Bruno lay across her lap, worn fur damp where her tears had fallen. Her eyes were red, her throat sore from whispering to no one who would answer. She had folded so many planes, dozens, maybe more. Each one had carried a piece of her, and each one had been crushed, ignored or swept away like trash. Her hope had grown thinner with every rejection, stretched so fragile it could tear at the slightest touch. And tonight, it tore. Her pencil lay broken on the desk, the lead snapped from pressing too hard. She stared at the dull stub, her hands trembling. She had no sharpener, no fresh paper beyond the scraps she had scavenged. The silence pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She curled her fingers into fists, whispering through clenched teeth. "They don't see me. They don't care. I could die here, and no one would ever know." Her nails dug into her palms. She squeezed harder, and one finger slipped against the sharp edge of the broken pencil. Pain flared, sudden and stinging. A thin bead of blood welled up and trailed down her skin. Elena froze. She lifted her hand, staring at the crimson smear in the lamplight. Something inside her shifted. If her words alone couldn't make the world listen, maybe her blood would. She pulled a fresh scrap of paper toward her, her breath shaky, heart pounding in her chest like a drum. With trembling fingers, she pressed her bleeding fingertip against the page, dragging it clumsily to form words. Each stroke was uneven, messy, but more alive than any pencil mark could be. "I am here. Please come." The letters smeared where her tears fell, blurring the edges, but the message was clear. It was not just ink now. It was her. Her life pressed into paper, proof that she was real, that she existed. She folded the paper slowly, each crease sticky with the faint smear of blood. Her hands shook so hard the folds came crooked, but she didn't care. She held the finished plane in her lap for a moment, whispering to Bruno as though the doll could bless it. "This is the last one. If they don't hear me this time, then maybe no one ever will." Her legs carried her to the window, weak but determined. She unlatched it and pushed it open against the cold night air. The city stretched below, lights glittering like a sea of indifference. She leaned out, her small hands gripping the paper plane, and whispered into the wind, "Please find someone who will listen." Then she let it go. The plane caught the current, wobbling, dipping, then gliding into the stream of air. Elena's breath hitched as she leaned farther out, watching it spiral downward. She pressed her bleeding fingertip against the glass, leaving a faint red smear as if to mark her presence, a final trace of herself in case the paper failed. Down and down it drifted, spinning between the towers, caught in the glow of street lamps. And fate, or something greater, guided it once more to the same place it had landed before. At the base of the tower, Officer Daniel Cross was finishing his patrol, Asher padding steadily at his side. The night was quiet. uneventful, until Asher froze. The shepherd's ears pricked, nose twitching, body suddenly rigid. His eyes locked on the fluttering white scrap descending from above. He lunged forward, tugging the leash, barking once in sharp command. Daniel frowned, following his gaze just as the paper plane tumbled to the wet sidewalk and skidded to a stop. Asher pounced on it immediately, paw pressing it down, teeth careful as he picked it up. His tail was stiff, his body vibrating with tension. He turned, pressing the paper into Daniel's hand with a soft whine. "What is it this time?" Daniel muttered, unfolding the damp paper carefully. The words struck him like a blow. "I am here. Please come." His throat went dry. The letters were smeared, crimson streaks staining the fibers of the paper. Blood. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a joke. A child had written this, and she was bleeding. Daniel's pulse quickened. He glanced at Asher, whose eyes burned with urgency, body straining toward the tower. The shepherd growled low, circling in tight arcs, the leash taut as steel. Daniel looked up at the towering glass structure, its windows glowing faintly against the night sky. For the first time, he didn't see a monument to wealth. He saw a cage, and somewhere inside that cage, a child was waiting. The note shook in his hand. He folded it carefully, slipping it into his pocket alongside the others. His chest felt heavy, but the decision had already begun to form, solidifying with each beat of his heart. This was no longer something he could ignore. Asher barked again, the sound ricocheting off the glass, echoing upward into the night. For a fleeting second, Daniel swore he saw a flicker of movement high above, as if a shadow had paused at a window. He drew a sharp breath. "We're going to find her," he whispered, almost to himself, almost to Asher, almost to the child who might be listening from above. The shepherd's tail thumped once, hard, a soldier acknowledging his commander's vow. The city around them carried on, blind and busy. But at the base of the glittering tower, man and dog stood together, united by a fragile paper plane streaked with blood. It was no longer just suspicion. It was truth. And it would change everything. The city was wide awake, but Daniel felt the silence of a grave settling on his chest as he stood across from the Hale Tower. Its glass panels caught the light like a fortress of mirrors, dazzling and untouchable. Yet Asher's restless stance told him there was more beneath the shine. Daniel tugged the leash gently, guiding the shepherd away from the entrance and into the narrow side street. The roar of passing taxis faded behind them. Here, the tower's hum was different, quieter, more intimate, as if the building itself exhaled. "Asher, easy," Daniel whispered. The dog's ears twitched, his nose lifted. He drew Daniel toward a row of delivery bays sunk into the foundation. Security lights bathed the pavement in harsh white, but no guards lingered here. Only dumpsters, loading docks, and steel doors lined with keypad locks. Daniel crouched near the shadow of a delivery truck, scanning the doors. One was marked for waste removal, another for service staff. His gaze caught on a third, unmarked, its paint chipped, its lock upgraded more recently than the others. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, jotting a crude sketch. Asher growled softly, tail stiff. His body pressed against Daniel's leg, signaling urgency. "You smell her, don't you?" Daniel murmured. His voice was barely a breath, but Asher's eyes flicked toward him, steady and certain. The sound of footsteps cut the moment short. A pair of men in gray uniforms emerged from the bay, pushing carts stacked with polished silver trays. Daniel shrank into the truck's shadow, one hand pressed against Asher's chest to still him. Upstairs again, "Strange kid," one muttered. "Not our business," the other replied flatly. "Keep your head down if you want to keep the paycheck." Their words sliced through Daniel like a blade. He didn't move until their voices faded into the echo of the service hall. Then he exhaled, slow, controlled, his jaw tightening. So it was true. There was a child up there. He waited until the bay was quiet again before leading Asher back into the street. The shepherd walked with renewed focus, every muscle alert. They moved past the polished glass doors, the lobby gleaming with chandeliers and marble. Inside, Veronica Hale's empire performed its illusion. Luxury, order, benevolence. But Daniel now knew the truth. It was a mask. He checked his watch. 1:43 a.m. The city wouldn't sleep for hours, but Hale Tower had shifted into a quieter rhythm. The wealthy inside were cloistered behind soundproof walls and velvet drapes, blind to what lurked in their own building. Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from Claire Bennett. "Don't do anything stupid." His lips curled into something between a grimace and a smile. He shoved the phone back into his pocket. Claire meant well, but she hadn't seen Asher at those doors. She hadn't heard the voices of men who knew more than they were willing to say. Daniel pressed his palm to the bloodied note in his folder. "Please help me. I am here." He turned toward the shepherd, crouching so their eyes met. "Tonight, we start peeling back the mask." Asher's tail flicked once, then stilled, his breath fogging faintly in the cool air. Daniel pulled his hood higher, blending into the restless blur of pedestrians still drifting along the avenue. From the corner cafe came the scent of burnt coffee. Across the street, a neon sign buzzed tiredly. He let the city swallow him, one more face in the crowd, but his focus never left the tower. He studied the rhythm of the guards, how often they circled, how long they lingered in the lobby, where their sightlines overlapped. It was muscle memory, honed from years in the field. Find the blind spot. Wait for the window. Asher sat patient at his side, head high, eyes fixed on the tower's glittering crown. Every so often, he gave a low whine, almost impatient. Daniel laid a steadying hand on his back. "Not yet," he whispered. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. A woman in an evening gown stepped out, her laughter brittle, clinging to the arm of a man whose suit was worth more than Daniel's salary. The doorman bowed, ushering them in. Another mask, more polish, more distraction. Daniel's eyes shifted back to the unmarked service door he'd sketched earlier. That was the artery, he was sure of it. Not tonight. Not yet. But soon. For now, he needed confirmation. Proof beyond instinct and whispers. He needed eyes inside. His gaze lifted toward the high windows. For a fleeting instant, he thought he saw movement again. A shape passing behind a curtain. Small, deliberate. His chest tightened. Asher saw it too. The shepherd gave a sharp bark, sudden and electric, before Daniel hushed him with a firm hand. But the damage was done. One of the lobby guards glanced their way, suspicion narrowing his eyes. Daniel forced a casual step backward, tugging Asher as though on a routine walk. His pulse hammered. He didn't exhale until the guard turned back inside. He crouched once more, gripping Asher's collar. His voice was low, almost a vow. "She's in there. And we're going to get her out." Asher pressed his head against Daniel's chest, steady and grounding. Together, they stared up at the Hale Tower, the night wind stirring around them. The building loomed like a giant, silent and arrogant. But for the first time, Daniel felt it crack. Not the glass, not the steel, but the illusion. He had seen the seam, heard the whispers, felt Asher's certainty burning like a flare in the dark. The hunt had begun. The final swing of the ram splintered the frame, the door collapsing inward with a groan that echoed down the mirrored corridor. For a heartbeat, silence held, thick, suspended, as though even the tower itself inhaled. Then the cold air spilled out, heavy with dust and something older, the scent of neglect. Daniel pushed forward first, his hand tightening on Asher's leash, though the shepherd hardly needed it. The dog surged into the dark room, barking sharply, claws raking against bare concrete. His voice, loud, commanding, alive, filled the chamber that had known only silence. The beam of Daniel's flashlight cut through the shadows. What it revealed lodged in his chest like a blade. A small figure lay curled on a cot against the wall, knees pulled tight to her chest, a ragged doll clutched in both arms. Her hair hung in tangled curls, her face half hidden, pale and hollowed by fear. When the light swept across her eyes, she flinched, burying her face into the doll's patched fabric. "Eleanor," Daniel whispered, his voice roughened by disbelief and fury. "Dear God." The officers behind him froze at the sight. They had expected signs, proof, maybe traces, but not this. Not a child, fragile and trembling, alive and staring at them with eyes wide as glass. Asher crept forward, his growl fading into a low whine. He lowered himself onto his belly, inching closer until his nose brushed the edge of the cot. The shepherd's tail swept once across the floor, tentative, reassuring. Elena flinched again, clutching the doll tighter. Her lips moved, barely audible. She said, "No one would come." She said, "Nobody cares." Daniel felt his throat constrict. He knelt slowly, setting the flashlight on the floor so its beam softened. He kept his voice low, steady, as if speaking to the most delicate witness he had ever known. "She lied to you, Elena. Someone cared enough to hear you." He reached into his coat, pulling free the worn folder. He unfolded one of the notes, the one stained with blood, and set it gently on the cot, where she could see. "I read these. I believed you." Her eyes flicked toward the paper, disbelief battling with hope. Her fingers loosened on the doll, just enough to touch the crumpled edge. When she felt the texture, her own handwriting, carried back to her, her breath hitched. "You found them?" Her voice cracked like thin ice. "Yes." Daniel's voice softened further. "And that's why I'm here." "That's why he's here." He nodded to Asher, whose amber eyes never left her face. The shepherd let out another soft whine, his nose nudging toward her doll, as if recognizing Bruno as part of the rescue too. For the first time, the smallest flicker of trust crossed Elena's face. She reached out with a trembling hand, pressing her palm against Asher's head. The shepherd stilled, leaning into her touch with quiet devotion. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down cheeks too thin for a child her age. She said my words would never matter, that even God didn't care. Daniel's chest burned with fury, but he held it back, letting his voice carry only certainty. "She was wrong. You matter more than she ever wanted you to know, and you're not alone anymore." Behind him, radios crackled with clipped voices, officers securing rooms, reporting no sign of Veronica. The air shifted with urgency, but Daniel kept his focus on the girl before him. "Can you walk, Elena?" he asked gently. She shook her head, body rigid. "She'll come back. If she sees you, if she knows, I'll..." Her words faltered into sobs. Daniel moved closer, lowering himself until he was eye level with her. "Listen to me. Veronica Hale can't hurt you again. Not tonight. Not ever." We have the law, and we have this warrant, and most of all, he nodded toward Asher. We have him. He doesn't lose children. He always brings them home. Elena's grip loosened on Bruno just enough to free one arm. She reached shakily toward Asher, burying her small hand in his thick fur. The shepherd's tail thumped once, twice, a silent vow. Daniel extended his arms. Let's go, kiddo. Let's get you out of here. For a moment, Elena hesitated, eyes darting to the door as though expecting Veronica's heels to strike against the marble. But then, with a slow, trembling motion, she shifted forward. Daniel scooped her up, her frail body feather-light in his arms. She clung to Bruno with one hand, to his collar with the other, her face pressed against his shoulder. Asher rose instantly, pacing beside them, his body pressed close as if shielding her from the world itself. "Clear the way," Daniel ordered. His voice clipped now, controlled. The officers moved, forming a shield as they stepped back into the mirrored corridor. The reflections multiplied around them. Officers, weapons, Daniel carrying the child, Asher glued to their side. But for once, the mirrors didn't mock. They bore witness. Each reflection captured the truth Veronica had tried to erase. The girl existed. And she was alive. As they neared the elevator, Daniel felt Elena stir against him. Her whisper was faint, almost lost in the static of radios. "You came." He pressed his cheek against her hair, his own voice breaking. "Always." The elevator doors closed, sealing them into the narrow box. For the first time that night, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. He looked down at Elena's small face, streaked with tears but alive, and at Asher's unwavering gaze fixed upward like a sentinel. The shepherd exhaled heavily, then laid his head against Elena's dangling hand. She stroked his fur absently, already clinging to him as if he had been hers forever. The ride down felt longer than any ascent, every second dragging with the weight of what might still come. Veronica's return, the storm of public outrage, the questions waiting below. But none of it mattered in that moment, not compared to the child whose pulse Daniel felt beating against his chest. When the elevator finally chimed, the doors slid open to reveal the lobby bathed in harsh police lights. Dozens of uniforms waited, their faces hard, but their eyes softening as they saw the girl in Daniel's arms. A murmur rippled through the room, quiet but fierce. Relief. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady, though his throat was raw. "Her name is Elena Hale, and she is safe." Asher walked at their side, Bruno still clutched in Elena's small hand. Together they crossed the marble floor, leaving the chandeliers and illusions behind. For the first time, the Hale Tower had surrendered its secret, and in that moment, beneath the flashing red and blue, the truth finally saw the light. The ram struck hard, shaking the frame until dust rained from the hinges. Asher barked furiously, claws tearing at the wood, body slamming with such force Daniel could barely hold the leash. "One more!" he shouted. The officer swung again. The lock groaned, metal bent, and with a thunderous crack, the door burst inward. The cold rushed out like a tide, not the polished chill of air conditioning, but something raw. Damp concrete, stale air, neglect. It clung to their skin like needles. Flashlights cut into the dark, revealing a narrow cot shoved against a wall. Thin sheets, twisted in restless knots. And on the floor, curled tight around a ragged doll, was Elena. Smaller than Daniel had imagined, she looked more shadow than child. Her tangled hair clung to her face, Her lips trembled, her skin pale as frost. Her eyes stayed shut, braced for punishment. Then Asher broke free. He bounded into the room, claws scraping the bare floor, but his bark softened, turning to a trembling whine. He pressed his nose to Elena's hands, nudging gently, coaxing. Her eyelids fluttered open, wide, glassy eyes fixed on him, breath catching in a tiny gasp. The doll slipped from her grasp as her shaking fingers touched his fur. "Asher," Daniel whispered. The shepherd lowered himself to the ground, tail wagging slowly, body curling around hers like a shield. Warmth replaced the cold. Elena's terror cracked, and for the first time, hope flickered across her face. Daniel stepped forward, kneeling. "Elena," he said softly, "you're safe now. We're here for you." Her lips trembled, a whisper escaping. "You came." Daniel's throat tightened. He reached into his coat, pulling out the blood-stained note. He held it in the beam of light so she could see. "We heard you. Every word. We listened." A sob burst from her chest. She buried her face into Asher's fur, clutching him as though he might vanish. Daniel motioned to a medic. A thermal blanket was handed forward, and he draped it gently around her thin shoulders. She flinched at first, then sank into the warmth, her hands never leaving the shepherd's collar. The officers stood frozen. Hardened men and women, used to raids and violence, blinked hard against the sting in their eyes. This room was no longer a crime scene. It was the truth hidden behind glass and chandeliers. Daniel pressed his radio. "Control, this is Cross. We've located the child. Alive." Relief rippled through the team. Elena lifted her head slightly, voice trembling. "Don't. Let her take me back." Daniel's jaw clenched. "She won't. Not ever again. I promise." Asher settled beside her, head resting on her lap, his body rigid but calm, protective. His ears twitched at every sound, his eyes locked on the door as if daring anyone to try. Daniel stood, scanning the room. The cot, the scraps of paper, the biting cold. Rage burned in his chest. Veronica Hale had been celebrated as a saint, but this was her truth. Then, footsteps thundered. Elena stiffened, arms clamping around Asher. The shepherd growled, low and dangerous, as the penthouse doors burst open. Veronica Hale stormed in, sequined gown glittering, diamonds at her throat. She looked every inch the socialite, except for the fury twisting her face. Her voice cut like glass. "What are you doing in my home? Do you have any idea who I am?" Daniel stepped forward, the warrant heavy in his pocket. "We know exactly who you are. That's why we're here." Her eyes flicked to the desk where officers had gathered Eleanor's notes. For the briefest instant, her mask cracked. Then she laughed, brittle, dismissive. "Children's scribbles, nothing more. My stepdaughter is abroad, thriving with relatives. You've been deceived." An officer held up the blood-stained note. The crimson smears glistened in the beam. "This was written here," he said flatly. Veronica's smile faltered. "Paint, ink, it proves nothing." Daniel moved aside, revealing Elena. Wrapped in the blanket, clinging to Asher, her face pale and lips cracked, she looked impossibly small. "Tell me that's thriving," Daniel said, voice edged with steel. For the first time, Veronica wavered. Her mask slipped, her voice lowering to a brittle murmur. "She's fragile, emotional. She makes things up. You can't take the word of a—" "Asher did," Daniel snapped. "He followed her cries when the city ignored her. He led us here when every record said she didn't exist. And you, his voice rose, raw with fury, you erased her. Silence fell heavy. The officers' faces hardened, no longer fooled by Veronica's rehearsed charm. The notes, the missing records, the cold room, the child herself. It was undeniable. Then Eleanor spoke. Her small voice, cracked and fragile, cut through the silence. She locked me here. Every head turned. Her words trembled, but carried the weight of truth that no lie could drown. She told me I don't exist, Eleanor whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. She said no one would ever find me. Her voice broke, but she forced the last words out. But he did. She pressed her face into Asher's fur, sobbing. He found me. Veronica staggered. For the first time, she looked small in her glittering gown, her empire of lies collapsing around her. Daniel's voice was quiet, but unyielding. Your lies end tonight. Two officers stepped forward, cuffs clicking around her wrists. The diamonds at her wrist clattered against marble as they turned her toward the door. She had built her empire on illusion, but it crumbled in seconds beneath the truth spoken by a child. Elena didn't look at her. She held tighter to Asher, clinging to his warmth. Daniel crouched beside them, his voice soft. She can't hurt you anymore. You're free. Elena's lips trembled. Promise? I promise. Asher pressed closer, nuzzling her cheek, sealing the vow with the only truth that mattered. And in that mirrored chamber, where lies had been polished to perfection, where the world had been fooled by glass and chandeliers, the truth finally broke through. A child was alive. Her words had been heard, and the shepherd who refused to stop listening had brought her home. Morning broke with headlines that cracked through the city like thunder. Prisoner in the glass tower. Philanthropist exposed. Stepdaughter found locked away. The child nobody saw. News vans crowded the street outside Hale Tower, satellite dishes angled toward the sky. Reporters spoke breathlessly into cameras, their voices tumbling over one another. Onlookers pressed against barricades, newspapers in hand, staring upward at the glittering facade that now looked less like a monument and more like a tomb. Across the city, screens replayed the same images. Officers carrying a trembling girl wrapped in a blanket, her face pressed into the fur of a German shepherd walking steadfastly at her side. The caption beneath one viral photo read, "She wrote notes on paper planes. Nobody listened, except him." Outrage erupted. "I walked past that tower every day," one woman sobbed to a camera. "I saw those papers fluttering. I thought it was kids playing. God forgive me, I didn't even stop to read one." A shopkeeper near the tower shook his head. She was crying for help right above us, and we all just kept walking. The city felt indicted. Every crumpled paper plane, every ignored scrawl, became a stain of guilt. Parents clutched their children tighter. Teachers spoke of it in classrooms. Church bells rang across neighborhoods where mothers whispered, "If you're ever afraid, speak. Someone will listen." And yet, beneath the outrage was shame. Would they really? At the precinct, phones rang without pause. Calls poured in from activists demanding reform, from citizens pledging to never look away again. Officers clustered around televisions, some muttering guilt. I thought those notes were a prank, while others stayed silent, eyes burning with regret. Daniel stood apart, watching the footage. Elena's frail hand tangled in Asher's fur, her face hidden in safety. To the world, Asher was now a hero. To Daniel, he was simply the one who had never doubted. Relief pressed heavy in his chest, edged with grief for every moment the girl had believed she was forgotten. The words of her last note echoed in his mind. "I am here. Please come." Now the whole city knew she was here. The hospital was quieter than the streets outside. Pale light streamed through blinds, laying soft lines across Elena's blanket. She looked small beneath the layers, her skin no longer ashen, color creeping back into her cheeks. Nurses brought her soup in small bowls, juice with straws. They left plush toys on the nightstand, coloring books, dolls with perfect dresses. But Elena touched them hesitantly, as if they belonged to other children. She clutched only Bruno, the ragged doll that had survived the dark with her. When doctors leaned close, she flinched. When nurses asked questions, she answered in whispers so faint they barely carried. Trust was not something she could give freely. Not yet. But each morning, the door creaked open, and Asher padded inside. The shepherd never rushed. He simply approached her bed, lowering his head until his muzzle rested near her hand. The first time, Elena froze. Then, in a whisper no louder than breath, she said, "You came back." She buried her fingers in his fur, tears spilling. Different tears this time, not despair, but release. Day after day he returned. Sometimes he lay with his head on her blanket like a sentinel. Sometimes he nosed Bruno gently, as if acknowledging the companion who had carried her through the silence. Nurses marveled. She trusted the dog before she trusted anyone else. One afternoon, a nurse left a red ball on the blanket, hoping to spark play. Elena ignored it until Asher nudged it with his nose. The ball rolled toward her. She blinked, startled, then pushed it back with trembling fingers. He returned it, tail wagging slowly, her lips twitched. Then came the faintest giggle, a sound so fragile it startled even her. The ball rolled again, and this time she pushed it with intent. Daniel, watching from the doorway, felt his throat tighten. It wasn't just play, it was proof. The child who had written her way into survival still had laughter buried inside. At night, nightmares woke her, dreams of locked doors, Veronica's voice echoing cold. She would cry softly, clutching Bruno. And every time, Asher stirred. He pressed his nose against her arm, whining low, until she reached for him. Then he curled against her bed, an anchor in the dark. Slowly, her sobs eased, her breathing found rhythm. One evening, as Daniel turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Will he come tomorrow?" He smiled gently. "Every day, as long as you want him to." Eleanor curled into the blankets, hand tangled in Asher's fur. For the first time, she drifted into sleep with something close to peace. Weeks later, the courthouse overflowed. Every bench packed, aisles crowded, cameras flashing until the gavel silenced them. The city had come to see the fall of Veronica Hale, the angel of charity revealed as a jailer. She sat rigid at the defense table, elegance reduced to a brittle shell. A tailored suit framed her, but her skin was pale, her eyes hollow. She folded her hands neatly, as though posture might hold together the crumbling facade. The charges read like a litany: child abuse, neglect, fraud, false testimony. Each echoed like a nail driven into her public image. Daniel sat across the aisle, his uniform crisp, badge gleaming. Asher lay at his feet, calm but watchful, amber eyes fixed on the woman who had tried to erase a child. Called to the stand, Daniel swore the oath and faced the jury. "I didn't come here because of protocol," he said evenly. "I came because a child begged for help, and nobody listened." He told of the paper planes, folded with trembling hands and tossed into the indifference of the city. He described the blood-stained note, how he almost dismissed it, and how Asher never allowed him to. "He knew before I did," Daniel said, glancing down at the shepherd. "He never let it go, and because of that, we found her." The prosecutor produced the worn folder of notes, holding them aloft. "Officer Cross, are these the same documents you recovered?" "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "They are Eleanor Hale's voice, and they are why we're here." The jury leaned forward, every eye on the fragile pages that had carried a life. Then the judge called Eleanor. The door opened. She stepped in slowly, a small figure in a simple dress, hair brushed neat. Bruno was clutched tightly in her arms. She faltered under the weight of so many eyes, until her gaze found Asher. His ears pricked, tail sweeping once. With him there, she walked on. The bailiff lifted her onto the witness stand. She swore the oath, her voice trembling but clear. The prosecutor placed a note before her. "Eleanor, is this yours?" Her eyes welled. "Yes." "Would you read it for the court?" The paper shook in her hands. She swallowed hard and whispered, "Please, help me. I am trapped." Her voice cracked, but the words carried like thunder through the chamber. The silence afterward was unbearable. She looked up then, meeting the eyes of strangers who once might have walked past her notes without reading. Her hand trembled as she pointed toward the shepherd. Nobody listened. Until him. He listened. Gasps rippled across the benches. A juror pressed a hand to her mouth. Another man wiped his eyes quickly. At the defense table, Veronica's composure fractured. "She's a child," she snapped, desperate. "She doesn't know what she's saying." The gavel slammed. Enough. But it was already over. The truth had been spoken, not by lawyers or officers, but by the girl who had been erased. Daniel exhaled, pride and sorrow heavy in equal measure. He met Elena's eyes across the room, giving the smallest nod. A vow. The verdict was still to come, but everyone in that courtroom already knew it. Veronica Hale's empire of glass had shattered. The city could never claim ignorance again, and the last word belonged to the child who had written her way into the world, and to the dog who had carried her voice when no one else would. The house was nothing like the glass tower. It was small, painted a faded yellow, its porch creaking with every step. A wind chime tinkled in the breeze, and the smell of fresh bread drifted faintly from the kitchen. Flower pots lined the windowsills, some blooming, others waiting to. Eleanor stood at the threshold, suitcase in one hand, Bruno the doll in the other. For a long moment, she didn't move. The doorway of a home was something she had once forgotten how to imagine. Her aunt, Margaret, knelt before her, tears bright in her eyes. "Sweetheart," she whispered, arms opening wide. Elena froze. Affection had been memory, not reality. Yet Margaret waited, patient, steady. Finally, Elena stepped forward. The embrace swallowed her, warm cotton, soft perfume, the faint smell of flour and soap. She trembled, but Margaret only held her tighter. "You're safe now," she murmured. "You're home." From the hallway, cousins peeked in, shy smiles, eager eyes. A boy about her age held a soccer ball. A younger girl clutched a stuffed rabbit. They didn't rush, only waved timidly. "These are your cousins," Margaret said gently. "They've been waiting to meet you." The boy stepped forward, holding out the ball. "We can play later, if you want." The little girl pressed her rabbit into Elena's hand. "She can be friends with your doll." Elena blinked down at the rabbit, then at Bruno, worn and ragged, but still hers. For the first time in months, her lips twitched upward. A smile, small, shy, but real. Margaret saw it, and her eyes filled again. "That's it, darling. You don't have to be afraid here." The living room brimmed with clutter and warmth, books stacked high, framed photographs on the mantel, a quilt draped across the sofa. The air smelled of roasted chicken, making Eleanor's stomach rumble. She blushed, but Margaret only smiled. "Eat as much as you like. No one will scold you." Later, Margaret opened the door to a lavender-painted bedroom. Quilts covered the bed, pillows stacked high. A small shelf brimmed with storybooks. "This is yours now," she said. Elena whispered the word back, disbelieving. "Mine?" "Yes, love. Yours." She climbed onto the bed. The quilt sank beneath her, soft and warm, nothing like the cot in the tower. She hugged Bruno tight, waiting for the illusion to vanish. But the warmth stayed. The voices of her cousins drifted from the hallway, and Margaret sat at her side, brushing tangled curls from her face. "You'll never be alone again," she promised. Eleanor studied her aunt's eyes, searching for cracks. She found only love. Slowly, she reached out, her small hand gripping Margaret's fingers. That night, when sleep came, it was gentle. For the first time, she smiled in her dreams. Spring unfurled in the park. Children's laughter rang across the grass. Dogs tugged at leashes, chasing squirrels and tumbling in the sun. On a bench, Elena sat wrapped in a light jacket, Bruno tucked at her side. Margaret stayed close, watchful. But Elena's gaze was fixed across the field, where Asher stood with Daniel. The shepherd whined, tail sweeping the grass. Daniel unclipped the leash. "Go on, boy." Asher bounded forward, paws pounding, eyes locked on Elena. She slid off the bench, crouching low. Her arms opened instinctively, and he barreled into her, pressing against her chest with joyous weight. The laughter burst from her throat before she could stop it. Bright, pure, like a bell. Her cousins raced over with a ball, eager to play. Elena hesitated, but Asher barked once, sharp and eager, as if answering for her. She giggled, nodding. The boy threw the ball. Asher tore after it, caught it mid-bounce, and thundered back. Elena squealed, clapping before throwing it again. Over and over, the cycle repeated. Throw, chase, return, laughter. With each toss, the shadows in her chest loosened, each giggle scattering the silence that had once swallowed her whole. Margaret wiped her eyes quietly, overcome. Daniel stood back, arms folded, the sound of Elena's laughter settling into him like sunlight after a storm. Asher dropped the ball at her feet once more. She hugged his neck fiercely. "Good boy," she whispered. "You always come back." Daniel's chest tightened. The words cut deep. "You always come back." He crouched near, laying a hand on Asher's back. "We almost didn't hear you," he murmured, half to himself. "But he did. He always did." Elena's eyes shimmered. She nodded solemnly, then buried her face in the shepherd's fur. The game went on until the sun dipped low, painting the sky amber. At last, Elena lay in the grass, head resting against Asher's side, her breathing calm. Daniel watched quietly, and for the first time, he believed she would heal. Months later, scaffolding rose at the base of Hale Tower. Crowds gathered, drawn by whispers. When the veil fell, it was not an advertisement or a monument to wealth. It was a sculpture, a cluster of paper airplanes, frozen in bronze, some tilted upward as if still climbing, Others dipped downward mid-fall. Every crease was carved in detail, fragile folds preserved in permanence. At the base, an inscription read, "Even the faintest voice deserves to be heard." Eleanor stood at the front, Margaret's hand on her shoulder. She was taller now, cheeks fuller, curls neatly brushed. Bruno, patched but still loved, was tucked under her arm. At her feet, Asher lay stretched on the pavement, his amber eyes reflecting the glow of the bronze plains. The crowd murmured softly. Parents lifted their children to see. Elderly couples held hands. Reporters scribbled notes, but reverently now, as if words themselves needed to bow. Elena stepped closer, her fingers grazing the cold metal folds, as if recognizing her own handwriting carved into them. She whispered something no one else heard, but Asher's ears twitched. He pressed his nose against her calf in answer. At the edge of the gathering, Daniel watched. He didn't need to be at the center. This was Elena's moment. Seeing her stand there, whole and unhidden, was enough. The mayor's words drifted over the crowd. This monument is not only for one child, though her courage has taught us much. It is for every voice ignored, every plea unseen. May we remember that hope can fall quietly, like a paper plane, and it is our duty to catch it before it is lost. Applause rippled through the square. Elena leaned down, pressing a kiss to Asher's head. She whispered, "You caught mine." The shepherd's tail thumped once against the stone, and in that moment, the story was no longer about a tower of glass, nor about the woman who had tried to erase her. It was about a child whose paper planes had carried across silence, and a dog who refused to stop listening. Her voice had been heard, her life reclaimed, and from then on, even the faintest whisper would remind the city. No child should ever vanish into silence again. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor lingered by the monument. She bent low, setting Bruno gently against the base of the sculpture, propping the doll so its stitched eyes faced the bronze airplanes. It was her offering, her way of leaving the dark years behind, while carrying them forward as truth. Her aunt called softly, and Elena stood. She looked back one last time at the planes, the doll, and the inscription carved in stone. Even the faintest voice deserves to be heard. For a long time, she had believed her whispers vanished into nothing. Now they stood immortalized in bronze, a reminder to an entire city that silence does not erase truth. And as she walked away with her family, Asher at her side, Daniel trailing quietly behind, the late afternoon sun caught the edges of the monument, casting long shadows of paper planes across the pavement, shadows that looked, for a fleeting moment, like wings. Sometimes the most powerful reminders of love and loyalty don't come from people at all. They come from a dog's steady eyes, a wagging tail, or the quiet way they refuse to leave our side. Stories like Eleanor and Asher's show us that German shepherds, and dogs everywhere, aren't just pets. They are family, protectors, and healers of the hidden wounds we carry. If you've ever felt that silent bond with your own dog, the one that doesn't need words, you already know how precious it is. And if you'd like to nurture that connection even more, I've found a resource that might inspire you. It's something you can explore at your own pace, nothing fancy, just a way to deepen the understanding you already share with your companion. I'll leave the link here if you're curious. At the end of the day, all our dogs really want is our time, our love, and to know we're listening. If this story moved you, maybe take a moment tonight to sit quietly with your dog, look into their eyes, and let them know you're grateful. It might mean more to them than you realize.